In early 1944, the skies over Europe were a graveyard of ambition. Every day, engines roared, bullets tore through the clouds, and thousands of men gambled their lives for air superiority. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was now struggling against the relentless tide of Allied air power. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs still fought with skill and ferocity, but the Americans had unleashed something that changed everything: the P-51 Mustang. At first, German intelligence officers didn't understand why the Luftwaffe's best pilots were suddenly being shot down deep inside German territory. Pilots who once outflew Spitfires and P-47s now radioed home in panic, whispering one word with disbelief: Mustangs. The Allies finally had a fighter that could escort bombers all the way from England to Berlin and back, and still outfight anything the Luftwaffe put in the air. For German engineers, this new American aircraft became an obsession. They wanted to know its secrets: how it climbed, how it turned, and how its pilots managed to control such power with apparent ease. The chance to study one came not through careful planning, but through fate. In early 1944, near Bad Zwischenau, northwest Germany, a damaged P-51B Mustang from the 355th Fighter Group made an emergency landing after a dogfight. The pilot, forced down after his engine took hits from ground fire, crash-landed in a field and was quickly captured. His plane, though battered, remained largely intact. To the Luftwaffe, this was a gift, a captured Mustang, almost airworthy. German engineers and mechanics rushed to secure the aircraft. The wreck was hauled to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's top-secret test center, the heart of German aviation research. Here, test pilots flew everything from experimental jets to captured Allied planes, studying their strengths and weaknesses. As the mechanics inspected the Mustang, their first impression was disbelief. The build quality was unlike anything they'd seen in an American fighter before. Every cable, every rivet, every switch seemed engineered for endurance. The cockpit layout was simple yet brilliant, designed not for engineers, but for pilots in combat. The Mustang, they realized, wasn't just a machine, it was a machine built around the pilot. Weeks of careful restoration followed. German mechanics replaced the bullet-riddled panels, patched up the radiator, and refitted the landing gear. The Merlin engine, a license-built version of Britain's Rolls-Royce design, was carefully tuned and coaxed back to life. When they finally powered it up, the hangar trembled. The sound was smooth and confident, utterly different from the raspy growl of their Daimler-Benz engines. One of the Luftwaffe's top test pilots, Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerch, was chosen to fly it. Lerch was no ordinary pilot. By 1944, he had test-flown over 100 different aircraft, including Allied ones. Calm under pressure and obsessed with understanding machines, Lerch prepared himself for what would be one of the most unique experiences of his career. The morning of the test flight was clear and still, the kind of silence that feels like anticipation before a storm. Mechanics pulled the Mustang onto the runway, its olive-drab paint now marked with black crosses. It looked alien among the gray German aircraft, yet somehow proud, a trophy of war turned into a tool of discovery. Lerch climbed into the cockpit. The interior smelled faintly of oil and leather, and the dials were laid out in a logical, pilot-friendly pattern. He took a deep breath, feeling both the thrill of curiosity and the weight of danger. If anything went wrong, he'd be flying an enemy plane with no manual, no spare parts, and no second chances. The Merlin engine started with a deep, steady growl. As the revs climbed, the aircraft shuddered with restrained power. Lerch eased the throttle forward. The Mustang rolled smoothly, obediently, like it understood him. With a gentle pull, the plane lifted off, and for the first time, a German pilot flew America's most feared fighter. At first, Lerch couldn't believe what he was feeling. The controls were light, almost too light. Most German fighters, especially the Bf-109, demanded constant muscle to handle at high speeds. The Mustang felt effortless, even graceful. He banked left, then right, and the plane responded instantly. He feels alive, he would later write in his notes. Climbing to 5,000 meters, he opened the throttle. The Merlin roared and the Mustang surged forward. The acceleration was smooth and relentless. At high altitude, where many German aircraft began to lose power, the Mustang kept climbing, steady, powerful, unshaken. The laminar flow wing, designed to reduce drag, cut through the air with ease.
But what truly impressed him wasn't just speed, it was balance. The aircraft handled predictably in every maneuver. Even when pushed into steep dives or sharp turns, it didn't snap or stall abruptly. It forgave the pilot. It let him fly on instinct. When Lurk landed, he climbed out of the cockpit in silence. Ground crews waited for his report, expecting criticism, or perhaps satisfaction at finding flaws. Instead, he simply said, "This aircraft has no vices." His flight report would later astonish Luftwaffe command. He described the Mustang as a masterpiece of design and handling, superior in almost every way to the Bf-109 and Fw-190. Its range, visibility, and control harmony gave it overwhelming advantages. Even its cockpit ergonomics impressed him. Everything placed logically, instruments easy to read, controls responsive without fatigue. Meanwhile, Allied pilots had no idea that deep inside Germany, their enemies were flying one of their own and admiring it. But the German fascination with the Mustang went beyond curiosity. They wanted to understand how it could fly such long distances, escorting bombers across Europe when their own fighters struggled to reach Berlin. Engineers studied its drop tanks, its fuel management system, and its high-altitude performance. They were particularly impressed by the Packard-built Merlin engine, which combined British design with American manufacturing precision. German aircraft like the Me-109G and Fw-190A were formidable dogfighters, but they suffered from short range and heavy control forces. The Mustang, by comparison, was a pilot's dream. It could cruise smoothly for hours, fight aggressively when needed, and still bring its pilot home. At the same time, the Luftwaffe was developing its own revolutionary weapons, the jet-powered Messerschmitt Me-262 and rocket interceptors like the Me-163 Comet. These machines promised speed beyond anything the Allies had, but they came with severe limitations: short flight time, unreliable engines, and dangerous handling. The Mustang, on the other hand, represented perfect balance. Not extreme innovation, but practical excellence. Weeks after Lurch's first flight, another German pilot, Kurt Bulligan, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, was invited to test the captured Mustang. Bulligan had over 100 aerial victories, many against American fighters. He was known for his sharp instincts and brutally honest assessments. After his flight, he reportedly said, "When I flew the Mustang, I knew why our pilots feared it. It was fast, but not just fast. It did everything right." He compared its maneuverability favorably to the Fw-190, noting that while the German fighter rolled faster, the Mustang's control harmony made it easier to fight for long periods without exhaustion. He said, "It's like fighting a boxer who never tires." Bulligan also noted the Mustang's outstanding visibility. The bubble canopy gave a nearly unobstructed 360-degree view, a dream in dogfights where seconds determined life or death. By contrast, German fighters often had thick frames and limited rear visibility, forcing pilots to constantly crane their necks. Luftwaffe engineers concluded that the Mustang was the result of lessons learned the hard way, combining British aerodynamic research, American production scale, and combat experience from the pilots who flew over Europe. It wasn't the fastest plane in the sky, but it was the most balanced. As the war dragged into 1944 and 1945, Germany's skies became a battlefield of desperation. The Allies bombed relentlessly, day and night. Mustangs escorted the bombers deep into the Reich, slashing through Luftwaffe defenses. Many German pilots never made it back. In their debriefings, survivors often spoke of the Mustang's uncanny ability to appear from nowhere, fight aggressively, and disappear before they could react. At Rechlin, the captured P-51B continued to fly in tests and mock dogfights against German aircraft. Reports showed that it consistently held its own, even when flown by pilots unfamiliar with its systems. This only deepened the respect and frustration among German officers. They had built incredible machines, but none that could match the Mustang's combination of range, reliability, and control. And yet, even as they studied it, they knew the truth. It was too late. The factories were being bombed, fuel was scarce, and the Luftwaffe was running out of pilots. The captured Mustang symbolized everything the Reich no longer had: time, resources, and the freedom to innovate without fear. Still, to men like Hans-Henry Lurch, the test flights were not about politics or war propaganda. They were about understanding the art of flight. And when he looked at the Mustang, he saw the future, a glimpse of what aviation could become after the war ended. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence units were beginning to intercept reports and rumors that the Germans had captured and were testing one or more Mustangs. At first, these stories were dismissed as propaganda. But as post-war records would later reveal, the Germans had indeed not only tested, but deeply admired the aircraft they were fighting against. It was a rare moment of mutual respect in a brutal war, when even enemies could acknowledge excellence. But the story of the captured Mustang was far from over, because as Germany's defeat loomed, those who had flown and studied it faced a new challenge: ensuring their findings, and perhaps the Mustang itself, didn't fall into the wrong hands.
The captured Mustang didn't rest long at Rechlin. Once the initial flight tests confirmed its extraordinary performance, the Luftwaffe's technical branch ordered a full series of comparative trials. The goal was simple: determine exactly how the Mustang measured up against Germany's best, the Bf-109G6, the FW-190A8, and even, under limited conditions, the revolutionary Me-262 jet. For the engineers and test pilots, this wasn't about propaganda anymore. It was about survival. If they could learn how to beat the Mustang, maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide in the air war over Europe. The testing schedule was grueling. The Mustang, designated T9 plus CK under Luftwaffe markings, was flown multiple times a day. The mechanics treated it like a sacred machine, meticulously recording every temperature, vibration, and control input. German observers watched each takeoff like a ritual, the deep growl of the Merlin engine rolling across the airfield, that haunting sound of power that seemed foreign yet mesmerizing. The first major comparison came against the Luftwaffe's workhorse, the Bf-109G6. The 109 had been Germany's backbone since 1937, a proven dogfighter that carried the Luftwaffe through the early years of dominance. But by 1944, the G6 variant was showing its age. Heavier, slower, and harder to handle at high speeds, it relied on pilot experience to stay lethal. When the mock dogfights began, Lurke took the Mustang into the air alongside an experienced 109 pilot, Oberleutnant Heinz Lenge. Both men were veterans, calm and analytical. They climbed to 20,000 feet and began the trial. At equal altitude and power settings, the Mustang steadily pulled ahead. Its laminar flow wings reduced drag so efficiently that it simply outpaced the Messerschmitt. When they entered a turning duel, the 109 tried to climb into its vertical advantage, but the Mustang stayed on its tail. Lurke radioed calmly, "She holds the turn easily, no heavy stick." Lenge's reply crackled back, "You could write a love letter up there while turning." Back on the ground, the data confirmed what pilots had felt. The Mustang could outclimb and outturn the Bf-109G at most altitudes, and more importantly, could maintain energy far longer in combat maneuvers. The German pilots were stunned. They had always believed their 109s, when properly flown, could best anything. But the Mustang's energy retention,
The way it kept speed and tight turns and high-G maneuvers changed that assumption completely. Then came the next test, the FW-190A8, the pride of the Luftwaffe's fighter command. The Focke-Wulf had earned a fearsome reputation, rugged, fast, and deadly in the hands of a skilled pilot. Its roll rate was unmatched, and its radial engine could take heavy damage and still bring the pilot home. This time, Lürke flew the Mustang while another ace, Major Karl Boris, took the 190. They climbed together, circling over the misty fields of northern Germany, sunlight flashing off their wings. At high speeds, the 190 could still dive faster, but once they leveled out and entered horizontal combat, the Mustang's advantages returned. Its lighter control forces and superior visibility gave Lürke a decisive edge. The Focke-Wulf could snap roll faster, but it bled energy quickly in sustained turns. After only a few minutes, Lürke was sitting comfortably behind Boris's tail. After landing, Boris shook his head. "It's like chasing a ghost. Every time you think you've caught it, it's already behind you." The Luftwaffe engineers noted something else: the Mustang's stability in dive recovery. German fighters often became dangerously unstable in steep dives, with control surfaces stiffening due to compressibility effects near transonic speeds. The Mustang, however, remained manageable. The Germans didn't know it at the time, but North American engineers had designed the Mustang's wings to delay shock wave formation, one of the earliest aircraft to manage airflow so efficiently. In a report filed at Rechlin, Lürke wrote, "The P-51 exhibits remarkable control harmony at all speeds tested. In climbs and turns, it can outlast our current fighters. Its visibility and pilot comfort are exceptional. Range and endurance exceed all Luftwaffe designs in service." These were words a German officer didn't write lightly. In a war built on ideology and pride, admitting superiority in an enemy's weapon required courage. But for Lürke and his peers, truth mattered more than ego. Meanwhile, Allied pilots continued to dominate the skies. Mustang squadrons like the 4th, 352nd, and 357th Fighter Groups swept across Europe, destroying aircraft on the ground and in the air. Every day, the Luftwaffe lost more pilots than it could replace. In desperation, German commanders turned to their new miracle weapon, the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed over 540 miles per hour, it could outrun and outclimb any propeller-driven plane on Earth. But it had problems: unreliable engines, limited flight time, and vulnerability during takeoff and landing. Still, the engineers at Rechlin couldn't resist one more test: a performance comparison between the Mustang and the Me-262. It wasn't a dogfight. The risk was too high. Instead, they flew coordinated tests: climbs, dives, acceleration runs. The Me-262 streaked ahead effortlessly, with its twin Jumo jets howling like thunder. But while the Mustang couldn't match its speed, it impressed the engineers for another reason: its stability. The 262's engines required delicate handling. Sudden throttle movements could cause flameouts or even explosions. The Mustang's Merlin, by contrast, was smooth, responsive, and forgiving. The jet is a stallion. The Mustang is a thoroughbred, powerful but disciplined. When the test flights ended, the data told a story the Luftwaffe couldn't ignore. The Me-262 was revolutionary but unreliable. The Bf-109 and FW-190 were proud veterans but outclassed. The Mustang, on the other hand, represented perfection of design philosophy, the balance between performance, endurance, and pilot comfort.
Word of these tests spread quietly among German fighter units. Some aces who visited Rechlin were allowed to sit in the captured Mustang, to feel the controls and see the cockpit that had become their enemy's weapon of dominance. One pilot, Oberst Walter Osau, an ace with over 120 kills, reportedly sat in the cockpit for several minutes without speaking. When he finally climbed out, he muttered, "No wonder they can fly so far and fight so long." To the Luftwaffe's technical officers, these tests revealed a painful truth. Germany had focused too long on high performance in bursts, climb rate, firepower, dive speed, but neglected what made an aircraft livable. The Mustang wasn't just fast. It was designed for endurance, for missions lasting hours, for pilots flying deep behind enemy lines without fatigue. In one of the last detailed test summaries of the war, Luftwaffe analysts wrote, "The P-51 Mustang, although not possessing extreme characteristics in any single area, demonstrates an unmatched combination of qualities. It may be considered the most effective all-around fighter aircraft currently in existence." As Allied bombers grew bolder, pushing deeper into the heart of Germany, these words became prophetic. The Mustang was the spear that pierced the Reich's armor. By the winter of 1944-45, fuel shortages crippled the Luftwaffe. Test flights at Rechlin became rare, often canceled due to lack of aviation fuel. Mechanics scavenged whatever they could, kerosene, synthetic blends, to keep a handful of planes flying. The captured Mustang was now more symbol than science project, a reminder of how far ahead the enemy had come. Still, even as bombs fell around them, the engineers continued recording data, sketching diagrams, and writing comparative reports. Many believed their work might be useful one day, if not for Germany, then for aviation itself. Then, in April 1945, as Allied troops closed in, the order came to evacuate Rechlin. The test center's archives were packed into crates, loaded onto trucks, and sent south toward Bavaria. The Mustang was hidden in a hangar under camouflage netting. Its fate after that remains uncertain. Some reports claim it was destroyed by retreating troops to prevent capture. Others suggest it was found intact by advancing Allied forces. When American intelligence teams arrived at Rechlin in May, they were astonished. They discovered a treasure trove of test documents, detailed evaluations of Allied aircraft, including Spitfires, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs. Among them were flight logs signed by Lurcha himself, praising the P-51's unmatched handling and range. These findings confirmed what the Allies already suspected. The Germans had indeed captured and flown their prized fighter, and respected it deeply. After the war, many of Rechlin's engineers and test pilots were interrogated by Allied intelligence. Some, like Hans Werner Lurcha, were later employed by postwar aviation research programs. His notes on the Mustang and other aircraft contributed to the understanding of control harmonization and aerodynamic efficiency in the emerging jet age. For the Americans, learning that their enemies admired the Mustang wasn't just flattery, it was validation. The aircraft that had turned the tide in Europe was now officially recognized as a masterpiece, even by those it defeated. But the story had one final twist. In 1946, captured German flight test documents were reviewed by the U.S. Air Technical Intelligence Unit. Among the reports was a handwritten note from a German pilot, anonymous, but likely one of the test team. It read, "If every fighter were like this, war would not depend on numbers. It would depend only on who had the courage to take off." That sentence, simple yet profound, encapsulated what the Mustang represented. Not just a technological achievement, but a symbol of the courage and craftsmanship that defined an era of aviation. Even in defeat, the Luftwaffe's pilots had found something to admire. In their final days of testing and evaluation, they had discovered respect, not for ideology, but for excellence. Meanwhile, the Mustang itself continued to shape the skies. It remained in service for years after the war, flying in Korea, in reconnaissance missions, and in the air forces of dozens of nations. The lessons learned from its design, range, efficiency, and pilot-centric control became the foundation for post-war fighters, both Allied
and axis descended. German engineers who later worked in British and American aviation industries often cited their wartime experiences at Rechlin. They spoke of the Mustang with almost nostalgic reverence, calling it the aircraft that taught them humility. In interviews decades later, Hans Werner Lurche described that first flight with quiet emotion. "When I took her up," he said, "I realized something extraordinary. The war made us enemies, but flying made us brothers. Up there, you don't fight for ideology. You fight for survival, for mastery, for the sheer beauty of flight." And the Mustang, she embodied that beauty. The captured P-51 had shown the Luftwaffe something they had long forgotten. The true superiority in the air didn't come from raw power alone, but from balance, endurance, and the bond between man and machine. As post-war historians pieced together the fragments of those Rechlin test reports, they saw a pattern emerge. The Mustang had not only dominated the war, it had quietly reshaped the philosophy of flight. The idea that a fighter could be comfortable, predictable, and reliable, that it could empower the pilot instead of punishing him, became the guiding principle of the next generation of aircraft. And perhaps somewhere in the ruins of Rechlin, when the dust of war finally settled, that captured Mustang rested in silence, the sound of its engine replaced by the echo of respect it had earned from both sides of history.
When the war finally ended in May 1945, the world awoke to silence. Cities lay in ruins. Skies that once screamed with engines were now still, and those who had survived, pilots, engineers, mechanics, found themselves staring at the remains of a world built on fire and metal. Among the shattered airfields and abandoned hangars of Germany, the Allies uncovered evidence of experiments, test logs, and flight data so meticulous that they could almost hear the voices of the men who wrote them. One aircraft in particular kept appearing in those reports, the P-51 Mustang. In the months that followed, Allied intelligence officers sifted through countless crates of documents marked Rechlin Flugprobung. Inside were the detailed flight assessments of captured enemy aircraft, Spitfires, P-47s, B-24s, and the Mustang. Each report carried the same tone of reluctant admiration. For the Americans and British officers reading those papers, it was surreal. The same enemy that had built the Me-262, the first jet fighter in history, had flown their own Mustang and declared it nearly flawless. What they didn't realize then was that this act of analysis, those quiet German test flights, would go on to influence how nations designed fighters for decades. After the war, Hans Werner Lurch and several other Luftwaffe test pilots were interrogated under Operation Lusty, the massive Allied effort to capture and study German aeronautical technology. Lurch was questioned for days about every aircraft he had flown, over 100 types, both German and Allied. When asked about the P-51, he smiled faintly before answering. He described it as an aircraft that any pilot could fly well, even under stress, a machine that forgives, a pilot's airplane. The intelligence officers listening to him understood what that meant. It was the ultimate compliment from a German test pilot, a man who had flown everything from fragile prototypes to deadly rocket interceptors. The Americans, fascinated, began comparing Lurch's notes to their own test data. At Wright Field in Ohio, the captured reports were translated and analyzed. Engineers studying the Mustang's design realized something profound. The Germans had learned from it too, and had applied those lessons in their own late-war projects. For instance, German aerodynamicists had been struggling with high-speed control stiffness in their piston fighters. After studying the Mustang, they noted the subtle shaping of its wings, a laminar flow profile that delayed drag rise at higher speeds. That discovery found echoes in post-war designs like the Focke-Wulf TA-183, the blueprint for what would later inspire the MiG-15 and F-86 Sabre. In a strange way, the captured Mustang had helped shape both sides of the Cold War. Many of the same German engineers who had examined it ended up working in Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States. At North American Aviation, a few former Luftwaffe experts quietly consulted on airflow studies during early jet development. They brought with them notes and diagrams from Rechlin, knowledge born in war, but now reborn in peace. One post-war American engineer later remarked, "When we read the German reports on the Mustang, it was eerie. It was like reading a love letter from one engineer to another, admiration through rivalry." In the years immediately after 1945, the Mustang continued to prove itself. The U.S. Air Force redesignated it as the F-51, and it flew again in the Korean War, strafing enemy convoys and supporting troops on the ground. But in the hearts of those who had once fought against it, it lived on as something else entirely, a benchmark. In 1948, a small group of former Luftwaffe pilots gathered in Hamburg for an informal reunion. Among them was a man who had flown test flights at Rechlin during the war. He brought with him a weathered notebook, his flight logs. Inside were entries about dozens of aircraft, each marked with short personal notes. Next to the P-51, he had written just one line: "The best machine ever built by men who loved to fly." That sentiment was echoed across generations. During interviews conducted in the 1960s for the Deutsche Luftfahrt Archive, several surviving pilots from the Rechlin program reflected on their time with the Mustang. One recalled, "We hated what it represented, but we loved what it was. It was perfect, not in technology, but in feeling." For them, the Mustang symbolized something that transcended the war. The idea that even in conflict, there could be respect, that machines could carry not only weapons, but also lessons.
Meanwhile, in the United States, the P-51 had become a legend. Air shows, museums, and movies celebrated its silhouette. The long nose, the sleek fuselage, the unmistakable roar of the Merlin. But behind that hero worship lay a deeper truth, one only the men at Rechlin had truly understood. The Mustang wasn't great because it was unbeatable. It was great because it was human. It was an aircraft designed around the pilot's experience. Clear visibility, forgiving controls, intuitive layout. Every switch and dial had purpose. Every curve of its wings was built for balance, not brute force. It made ordinary men feel like aces. And that, more than anything, was what made it feared. In 1946, during a classified Allied debrief, one British officer summed it up perfectly. "The Germans built weapons. We built instruments of flight." And that made all the difference. Over time, fragments of the original captured Mustang story resurfaced. Some believed it had been destroyed during the chaos of Germany's collapse. Others claimed it was taken by advancing U.S. troops and quietly shipped back to America for study. No definitive record was ever found. But the documents, those precious test reports, survived. Many were stored in the archives of the U.S. Air Force Historical Research Agency, their yellowed pages still bearing the signatures of German engineers. The language was technical, but between the lines, there was awe. Phrases like remarkable harmony, superior ergonomics, and exceptional climb retention appeared again and again. The Luftwaffe, once masters of innovation, had admitted defeat, not through surrender, but through admiration. As the Cold War began, the lessons of the Mustang quietly took flight in new forms. The jet fighters of the 1950s, the F-86 Sabre, MiG-15, and Hawker Hunter, all carried echoes of its philosophy: balance, efficiency, and respect for the pilot's hand.
Even the F-16 Fighting Falcon decades later embodied that lineage. A pilot-centered machine that blended instinct and engineering into one living form. In a sense, the Mustang never truly stopped flying. Its spirit lived in every aircraft that valued harmony over haste, grace over aggression. By the time Hans Werner Lerche passed away in 2003, aviation historians regarded him as one of the few men who had flown almost every major fighter of the Second World War. In his memoirs, he devoted an entire chapter to the captured P-51. He described how, even after decades, he could still remember the feeling of that first takeoff, the smooth lift, the subtle balance of the controls, the sound of the Merlin engine rising into the sky. It was not just another flight. It was the moment I understood what flying could be. We had built machines for war. They had built one for the pilot. Those words echoed through time. Today, aviation museums around the world display restored Mustangs, some polished to mirror finish, others weathered with scars of history. Visitors walk around them in quiet reverence, reading plaques and imagining the men who flew them. Few realize that once upon a time, even the enemy marveled at the same machine. A handful of German test documents remain preserved in the archives of the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg. Their pages describe not hatred, not rivalry, but admiration. The ultimate testament to what happens when engineering crosses borders, even in war. As one historian put it, the P-51 Mustang was not just a fighter. It was a bridge between technology and humanity, between enemies who loved flight more than they loved victory. In the end, perhaps that is why the story of the captured Mustang endures. It reminds us that war may divide nations, but it cannot divide passion. That even in the darkest chapters of history, there were moments when courage, curiosity, and respect rose above destruction. When German pilots flew the captured Mustang, they didn't just test a machine. They rediscovered the joy of flight itself. And when they returned to Earth, they admitted something rare and pure. We had never seen handling like it. The sky, after all, has no sides. Only pilots and the dreams they chase. Thank you for watching this journey into history. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more cinematic World War II documentaries. Your support keeps history alive and ensures these incredible stories reach those who appreciate them most.